This lecture will be some slightly shorter lecture than usual. What I first want to do is finish off the discussion of clinical psychology from last lecture, and then have a little brief discussion about some very interesting research on happiness. We ended last lecture with a discussion of some of the history of treating mental illness. And we saw that it was rather gruesome, unsuccessful, and arbitrary. For the most part, we do better now. And Dr. Nolan Huxema reviewed some of the therapies with focus on therapies for depression. The textbook talks in detail about therapies for different disorders, including schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, and so on. The question which everyone is interested in is, does therapy work? And this proves to be surprisingly difficult to tell. Part of the problem is, if you ask people who go into therapy, did you get better after therapy? For the most part, they'll tell you that they did. But the problem is, this could be a statistical byproduct of what's called regression to the mean. So the idea looks like this. This line plots how you feel, from great through okay to awful. And it goes up and down. And in fact, in everyday life, some days are going to be average, some days will be better than average, some days worse than average. You could plot your semester. You could do a plot every morning, wake up, or every night before you go to bed. You could put yourself on a graph, and it'll come out to some sort of wiggly thing. Statistically, if something is above average or below average, it's going to trend towards average, just because that's a statistical inevitability. When do people go to therapy? Well, they go to therapy when they're feeling really crappy. They go to therapy when they're feeling unusually bad. Even if therapy then has no effect at all, if it's true that people's moods tend to go up and down, after you feel really bad, you'll probably improve rather than get worse. And so this could happen, a normal flow could happen just even if therapy has no effect at all. And so simply getting better after therapy doesn't tell you anything. On the worst day of your life, you could do naked jumping jacks on the roof of your college for 10 minutes. I guarantee you, your next day will probably be better. That doesn't mean naked jumping jacks are helping you. Rather, it just means that the day after the worst day of your life usually is not as bad as the worst day of your life. It can get worse, but usually it just trends to average. What you've got to do then is you have to take people at the same point who would get treatment and compare them to people who do not get treatment, or what we call a control group. And this is an example of this. So this is for people who are depressed. This is statistically equal. They start off pre-therapy. They all go for therapy. But because in this example there's a limited number of therapists, some of them are put on a waiting list and others get a therapist. It's arbitrary, it's random, which is which, making it a very good experiment. And in this example, you can see those who received cognitive training were better off. They have lower depression scores than those that received no therapy at all. In general, in fact, we can make some general conclusions about therapy. Therapy, by and large, works. People in treatment do better than those who are not in treatment. And that's not merely because they choose to go into treatment. Rather, it's people who are in desperate straits, who seek out help. Those who get help are likely to be better off than those that don't get help. Therapy, for the most part, works. We can't cure a lot of things, but we can often make them better. Different sorts of therapy works best for different problems. And again, depression proves to be an illustrative example. If you have everyday unipolar depression, that is, you feel very sad and you show other symptoms associated with depression, an excellent treatment for you is some combination of cognitive behavioral therapy and possibly antidepressant medications, like SSRIs. If you have bipolar depression, the cognitive behavioral therapy is useless, but medication is your best bet. And so on for all the other disorders. Each disorder has some sort of optimal mode of treatment. If you suffer from an anxiety disorder, cognitive behavioral therapy can be of help. If you're schizophrenic, it's probably not going to be of much help at all. And so different disorders go best with different sorts of therapies. Finally, some therapists do better than others. So for reasons that nobody fully understands, there are good therapists, and there are better therapists, and there are bad therapists. And there's great individual differences in the efficacy of an individual therapist. Finally, putting aside then the difference in therapies and the difference in therapists, does it make sense to say that therapy in general works? And the answer is yes. And this is in large part because of what clinical psychologists describe as non-specific factors. And what this just is a term meaning properties that all therapies, or virtually all therapies, share. And I've listed two of them here. One of them is support. No matter what sort of therapy you're getting involved in, be it a psychoanalyst, or a behavior therapist, or a cognitive therapist, or a psychiatrist who prescribes you medication, or someone who makes you go through different exercises or keeps a journal, you have some sense of support, some acceptance, empathy, encouragement, guidance. You have a human touch. You have somebody who, for at least some of the day, really cares about you and wants you to be better. And that can make a huge difference. Also, you have hope. Typically, there's an enthusiasm behind therapy. There's a sense that this might really make me get better. And that hope could be powerful. Sometimes this is viewed under the rubric of a placebo effect, which is that maybe the benefits you get from therapy aren't due to anything in particular the therapist does to you, but rather to the belief that things are going to get better. Something is being done that will help you. And this belief can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Placebo effect is often used sort of in a dismissive way. Oh, it's just a placebo. But placebos can be powerful. And even if it's useless from a psychological theory point of view, even if the therapist runs around and dances, I have dancing on my mind now, while you sit in a chair and watch him dance, if you believe the dancing is going to make you better, it may well help. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about therapy. Any questions about therapy? Yes?
It seems like the hypothesis of regression to the mean is, like, it seems a little odd to me, like, thinking maybe that, I mean, there has to be some reason that something regresses to the mean. It seems like, if you impose the mean afterwards, then of course the regression doesn't impose the mean after
Fair enough. The question is, the assumption of regression to the mean seems sort of arbitrary because it depends what the mean is. Always after the fact, you can apply an average to it and say, look, this is the average, but how do you know beforehand? It's a good point. When you talk about regression to the mean, it adopts certain assumptions. The assumption is there really is an average throughout much of your life. And things go up and down within that average. And for the most part, that's true for things like mood. For most of us, we have an average mood, and we have bad days, and we have good days. It's always possible that you have a bad day, and then from there on in, it's just going to go down and down and down. But statistically, the best bet is, if you have a bad day, you're going to go back up to the mean. In some way, you don't even have to see it from a clinical point of view. You could map it out yourself. Map out your moods, and the days where you're most depressed, sooner or later, you're likely to go up. Similarly, on the happiest day of your life, odds are the next day you're going to go down. And there's nothing magical about this. This is just because under the assumption that there really is an average built into each of us. If human behavior was arbitrary, it would be like a random walk, but it's not. We seem to have sort of set points and aspects of us that we fall back to that make the idea of a mean a psychologically plausible claim.
You
Yes?
mentioned study, how do you know that it's the therapy that helps and not the waiting list that kept you?
That's a good question. Yes, in that study, it's a perfectly good hypothesis that the sort of anxiety of being told, I see you've come here for help. We can't give it to you. Congratulations, you're a control group. Causes anxiety. In other studies, the control group doesn't know they're the control group. So sometimes you can do an intervention where you say, congratulations, everybody in intro psych who did very low on the depression inventory, which many of you filled out. We're going to do something to you. And then the rest of the people don't even know that they haven't been chosen. So you're right. It's a perfectly good point. Knowing you're not chosen could have a deleterious effect. And the way to respond to that is you have other studies that don't use that same method. Okay. I want to end with happiness, and it's a strange thing to talk about in psychology. Most of psychology focuses on human misery, most of clinical psychology. There's the psychology we spoke about through most of the semester on vision and language and social behavior, but typically when people think about interventions, what they think about is people having problems, and then we figure out how to make them better. They're schizophrenic, they're depressed, they're anxious, they're just not making it in life. And psychologists try to figure out how to make things improve. And in fact, a lot of information I gave you at the beginning of lecture last class, where I reviewed all of the disorders, is in this wonderful book called DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. If you really want to diagnose people and come to have a belief in your own mental instability, browsing through that book is a treat. Everything that can go wrong in mental life, from Asperger's syndrome to fetishes to paranoid schizophrenia, is all in that wonderful book. But a lot of psychologists have been disturbed by the focus of our field on taking bad people, people who are broken, people who are sad, and bringing them up to normal. And they've started to ask, can psychology give us any insight into human flourishing? How to take people how to study people who are psychological successes, how to take people who are psychologically okay and make them better. And this is the movement known as positive psychology. And it has its own handbook now, the Handbook of Positive Psychology, listing psychological strengths, listing virtues, ways, what psychology tells us about how we can be at our best. Some of this work in positive psychology is, in my mind, real crap. A lot of it is some combination of new age banalities by people who are striving to get more grant funds and end up on Time magazine. On the other hand, and so some of it is really bad. You could imagine this attracts every self-help huckster you could imagine. On the other hand, a lot of this work is quite neat, quite interesting, and quite promising. And what I want to do is tell you what I think is the most interesting research from this movement concerning happiness. Now, there are a lot of good books on this, and I'm going to recommend books, which I haven't been doing much in this class. Marty Seligman is the pioneer of positive psychology, and he's written an excellent book called Authentic Happiness. Jonathan Haidt is a brilliant young scholar who's also done a lot of work on disgust and morality. He did the sex with dead chicken study we discussed earlier. This is one of my favorite books, by Happiness by Nettle, because it's smart, it's beautifully written, and it's extremely short. And Dan Gilbert's book, Stumbling on Happiness, is a very, very funny book and very smart book, and is now on a New York Times bestseller list. So there's no shortage of books on happiness. So the starting point is, and a lot of research on happiness starts with a basic question: how happy are you? And we're psychologists, so tell us on a scale of 1 to 10, where 5 is average, 10 is super duper. The most common answers, interestingly enough, are high. They're 7 or 8. How many people in this room would give themselves a 7 or an 8? Okay. How many a 9 or a 10? All right. How many a 10? Good. Good. Maxed out on happiness. It turns out that most people think that they're pretty happy. There's a Lake Wobegon effect with happiness. Most people think they're very happy. In fact, most people think they're happier than most people, which shouldn't really happen. This question, how happy are you from 1 to 10, has been asked all over the world. So, and it turns out there are slight differences depending on how old you are. There are slight differences depending on your place within a country, California versus New York. There are slight, subtle differences between men and women at different points. Somewhat paradoxically, although women are more vulnerable to depression than men, still, on average, women are slightly happier than men. The country-by-country data is quite interesting. In one study, they looked at 42 countries. The happiest people on Earth. Well, first, no country believed they were unhappy. The people in no country of these 42 countries. I mean, you're thinking there's some really bad countries to live in, and I don't know if they were tested. But of these 42, everybody said they were above average. The happiest people on Earth, the Swiss. They think they're just so happy. I was talking to people about this last night, and they suggested chocolate. The saddest people on the sample, the sad Bulgarians. You are wondering, what about Americans? Americans are actually pretty happy. 7.7 when we are a happy country, full of happy people. Now, I'm going to talk about a lot of research that's based on the data you get when you ask people how